Okay, so it's a pleasure once again to welcome everybody to the Chem Talk today, which is by Associate Professor Lars Hemmingsen. And the topic is molecular structure and dynamics probed by perturbed angular correlation of gamma ray spectroscopy. And that's normally in short called PAC spectroscopy, and it's a quite exotic technique. I think Lasse is one of the world-leading experts within this technique, so I'm looking very much forward to this Chem Talk.
Thank you, Pernille. And it's a field where it's very easy to be world leading because there are very few people doing this. Thank you, Jens Christian, for the invitation to give this presentation. And thank you for attending. I will adhere roughly to the abstract I made, but there may be some small changes. So if by the end of the talk you miss something, ask about it, and I probably have an extra slide. So, perturbed angular correlation of gamma rays is the topic. It's a nuclear physical spectroscopic technique. But before I dive into that, tradition and Jens Christian dictates that I should say something about my career, so I will briefly do that. And hang on, there you go. So in 1992, the most important event was that the Danish national side of soccer won the European Championship, of course. But incidentally, the same year, I graduated with a master's in physics from the University of Copenhagen. And this is a photograph of Michael Jensen, who helped me significantly during that time. My actual supervisor was Leif Sarholt Christensen, but I couldn't find a picture of him, so that's it. I then continued to do a PhD at the Royal Veterinary and Agricultural University, which is nowadays part of the University of Copenhagen. I did that with Robert Bauer as my supervisor. And here you see a young Morten Bjørn who tried to teach me bioinorganic chemistry, and Eva Danielsen, who is a very skilled PAC spectroscopist. So this is the first time I got acquainted with PAC spectroscopy. And next, I got a scholarship from the Danish Research Councils to go abroad. So I went as far as Lund, which is roughly 60 kilometers from Copenhagen. But there was a very strong theoretical chemistry group there, and I was supervised by Ulf Ryde. And André Sadley also at that time helped me a lot learning quantum chemistry. And in return, I brought him dark Danish bread whenever I went back and forth from Denmark to Sweden. I then continued to do a second postdoc in theoretical chemistry again, actually, at the Institut de Biologie Structurelle in France, supervised by Martin Field, where I also met a bunch of interesting and exciting people, among others, Patricia Amarat and Konrad Hinsen. And I wonder if some of you theoretical chemists may know Konrad. He developed the so-called molecular modeling toolkit in Python at that time. And then I went back to Denmark, became assistant professor, associate professor, a little trip to the Technical University, and then finally University of Copenhagen. And nowadays, my interests are equally much a random walk, you could say, but somehow revolving around biological inorganic chemistry. And this is the logo of the Society of Biological Inorganic Chemistry, where you see the tree of life rooted in the periodic table, of course, not only in the organic elements, but also in the inorganic elements. And these are some of the interests I have currently, in particular, protein self-assembly and how metal ions affect that process in relation to neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease. In a project led by Attila Jankso from University of Szeged in Hungary, we explore bacterial proteins which are sensors of, for example, these toxic ions, and they are metalloregulatory proteins controlling expression of genes that typically are efflux pumps, so the bacteria can get rid of these toxic elements or toxic ions. Another project is radioactive metals in diagnostics and therapy, led by Mariana Tosato and Mattia Esti from Italy. And the newcomer is RNA on the Rocks, which is an Origin of Life project in collaboration with Tue Hessenkamp and inspired by Simon Eiby, who's a PhD student with Tue currently, where we aim to explore if biological macromolecules like RNA may have been formed in small warm ponds of water roughly 4 billion years ago on Earth. And everything is still based on spectroscopy and computational chemistry that I learned during my early career. But today it is PAC spectroscopy. And what you see here is the most important part of the instrument. There are 6 detectors here. This instrument is located here in Copenhagen. And at the center, you would put a sample, a regular test tube, for example, and measure some gamma ray emissions. I'll get back to the details in a second. My group also goes to ISOLDE at CERN roughly once a year. And here you see a group of people there. If you look carefully, this is a young Peter Tulstrup, who has gone there several times together with me, and also without me. And ISOLDE is a wonderful factory where they can produce all kinds of radionuclides. So if you have an element where you want a radioactive isotope of that element, they can probably make it. So we go there also to do this PAC spectroscopy, partly because you need a radioactive nucleus. And in this particular case, I'm showing you the decay of cadmium-111M, which can be produced in a metastable state, half-life of 49 minutes, decaying to an intermediate state with a shorter half-life, and then to the nuclear ground state. Now, so why do we need a gamma-gamma cascade, as it's called? Well, the first gamma ray carries off some angular momentum, and due to conservation of angular momentum in the nuclear decay, that puts constraints on the possible orientation of the nuclear spin in this intermediate state. So in a more concise phrasing, it means detecting the first gamma ray in a certain direction means that you have selected an oriented ensemble of nuclear spins here. The second gamma ray is then emitted from that ensemble. And again, by virtue of conservation of angular momentum, it will be emitted in a non-isotropic manner, so in a non-random direction. And this gives rise to this angular correlation of the 2 gamma rays. So if the first is detected in this direction, the probability of detecting the second gamma ray in a certain direction is given by the distance from the center here to the curve. So if you have a detector up here, that's where the probability is smallest. If you have it over here, the probability is largest. In itself, that is completely uninteresting in terms of chemistry or biochemistry, because it only reflects the nuclear properties of the decay. However, if the nucleus interacts with the surroundings, and that could be magnetic fields or electric interactions, while it is in this intermediate state, then this angular correlation of the gamma rays is perturbed. So now you have the full acronym, perturbed angular correlation. And the way it's perturbed is that a magnetic field, just like an NMR, will make the nuclear spin precess in a semi-classical picture. And the precession frequency reflects the interaction with the local environment. And precession of this nuclear spin makes this angular correlation rotate in time. So if you sit up here at time equals 0, which is controlled by the detection of the first gamma ray, there's a relatively small probability of detecting the second gamma ray here. A little while later, this distribution has turned 90 degrees, and suddenly you have the maximum probability of detecting the second gamma ray here. And therefore, as a function of time, you will see an oscillation here with minimum, maximum, minimum, maximum. And that's what's shown over here. You see, starting the clock, when you detect the first gamma ray, the main component or main control of the time dependence is, of course, the half-life of the intermediate level here. So that has a half-life of 85 nanoseconds. an exponential decay. But on top of that, you can see these small wiggles, which is exactly reflecting this so-called hyperfine splitting of the intermediate nuclear level. And it's not just one frequency in this case, which is pure electric interactions. There are three frequencies. And you can, by the way, see that the sum of the two lowest frequencies must add up to the highest frequency. This is a spin 5 half nucleus. That's why you get this kind of spin, this hyperfine splitting here. Now you process the data, you don't really care about the exponential decay. You want these wiggles. And in a clever way, you can process the data to get this function, which is just a sum of three cosine functions with these three frequencies. And it's more illustrative, I guess, to Fourier transform them. Then you get the three frequencies here. And you can see that the lowest frequency and the next lowest add up to the highest, as it should, according to this splitting diagram. Okay, so the main point here is you can get a fingerprint of the local structure. And the first example I want to give you here is in a project that was led by Vince Pecoraro, and still is, from the University of Michigan. He gave a presentation a little more than 25 years ago at a conference in Toulouse, as far as I remember, where he presented data on this particular designed, de novo designed protein. There are three helices with this amino acid sequence, and you can see there are some leucines here placed strategically such that you get one side of the helix as a hydrophobic patch, and then they self-assemble, for example, into trimeric coiled coils. And at the center, you can engineer, and this is what Vince and his group did, a metal binding site, all kinds of metal binding sites, and this is one of those proteins they engineered. Now, Vince presented this NMR spectrum and said that this frequency this resonance at roughly 625 ppm, it was a little difficult actually to determine whether that reflected cadmium binding to these three thiolates in a trigonal planar structure, or if it was a four-coordinate site with an additional axial ligand like a water molecule, for example. So we did PAC experiments and got this pretty awful spectrum, and there are reasons for that. If you look very carefully already now with your knowledge of PAC, you can say there are three peaks here. However, and there should be three peaks in a cadmium PAC spectrum if there's one binding site. However, this frequency plus this frequency adds up to something which is out here. So these three peaks don't go together, and therefore we could actually unambiguously say there are two coexisting coordination geometries in this protein. We could even then, by calculations, propose that it would be a trigonal planar structure and a four-coordinate structure with a water molecule. So Vince and his group went back to the lab and redesigned the protein, introducing, instead of a cysteine, a more bulky amino acid, penicillamine here, in order to try to eliminate the space for the water molecule. And conversely, over here, they substituted leucine just above the metal site with alanine. Alanine is a little smaller. Oops, sorry. And then the aim was to stabilize the four-coordinate structure. And I guess this is one of the rare cases where it actually worked out perfectly. This is the PAC spectrum of this species, and this is the PAC spectrum of this species. You can recognize the peaks here. This corresponds to this. This corresponds to this. This corresponds to this. So they were able to make proteins that selectively bound either the four or the three-coordinate species, and the NMR spectra for these two species give these two resonances, and you can actually see here you have a fast exchange on the NMR timescale giving one signal, and you can predict this by the relative amplitudes of the PAC data. So that was all fine and dandy. So this is an example that you can provide local structure, and I should maybe say the magnifying glass of PAC spectroscopy relies on the so-called electric field gradient, which means that you can see things within 2, 3, 4, 5 angstroms of the probe, something like that. Now, this also told us that in NMR it was in fast exchange. In PAC we could see both species, so it was in slow exchange. Therefore, the jumping on and off from the water molecule had to appear on a timescale in between the timescale of PAC and NMR, which means in between nanoseconds and milliseconds. And yes, this slide I included to remind myself to step back a little bit and say, why is this interesting at all? It's always fun that you can build proteins and metal sites and investigate them. And from a spectroscopic point of view, it's very satisfying that you can understand what you're measuring. But why is it interesting? And this is a slide I stole from Manfred Eichen's Nobel laureate, Nobel Prize presentation from 1967, where he made a periodic table reflecting reaction rates. And the numbers you see here is, for example, for aluminum 3+. The one there means that the aqua ion of aluminum exchanges roughly 1 water molecule per second. Very slowly. It's an inert ion, you could say. While zinc or cadmium, for example, exchanges on much faster, much shorter timescale. So cadmium exchanges roughly 3 times 10 to the 8 water molecules per second. So residence times of the water molecules on the nanosecond timescale. So, okay, we thought then why not turn up the temperature of the PAC instrument and see what happens. So we went from -20 to 50 degrees, and we were in fact extremely fortunate that in that temperature range, you move from slow exchange to almost to fast exchange, where you see an average weighted signal here. So we were able to also then determine the on-off rate here of the water molecule, or the residence times, the lifetimes of these two species, which is what is given down here. You can see it's roughly 10 times longer than for the cadmium ion in solution, which is perhaps not strange when you put this large organic molecule around the binding site. It's a little slower than it's in solution. There are very few data on water exchange rates in proteins, so less than a handful or so. So this is one of them. And they are very relevant, in particular for zinc enzymes, which often hydrolytic zinc enzymes rely on a metal coordinated water molecule or hydroxide for their function. The NMR resonance, you can see here, changes with temperature, but this is only because you shift the equilibrium of this equilibrium towards the 3-coordinate species when you increase the temperature. So given that we were so fortunate, we thought, okay, now it would be interesting to explore what happens if you change the protein, for example, a decent way away from the metal side. What happens to the structure and the dynamics of the metal side? And this part of the figure is the same as the previous slide. This is new, where we replaced, or this I shouldn't say we, because this is Vince and his group replaced the leucine at this position, roughly 10 angstroms from the metal side, by alanine, which is smaller. Sorry. And then we looked at what happened to the structure and the dynamics. So the structure is reflected in the position of the peaks. And that didn't change at all, actually. So there was no perturbation of the structure by this substitution. However, you can almost see here that if you compare the relative intensities of the green and the pink signal, this pink signal has more intensity than this one. So surprisingly, or whatever you would say, this substitution actually stabilized the 3-coordinate side at the metal side. And actually, this can only happen if you also change the lifetime of the two species, because of course the equilibrium constant is related to the ratio of the exchange rates. And we also ran the temperature series and could say that there was change of dynamics. So in this particular case, a substitution relatively far from the metal side had no effect on the structure, but it did significantly affect the dynamics. And one might wonder whether this is also going on in proteins, that not only structure is optimized, but also dynamics for their particular function. So now I shift gears to a different kind of dynamics. This is a stochastic process where the molecule is hit by solvent molecules and therefore tumbles around in Brownian tumbling or molecular rotational diffusion. And we did here also use one of Vince's proteins because they give such nice signals. So it was an appropriate molecular probe for this project where we changed the viscosity. And if you look carefully here, you will see now I changed away from the Fourier transform and back to the time regime. And this is the signal you get in high viscosity solution. And if you drop the viscosity to lower values, we added various amounts of sucrose to do that. You can see the signal is damped and almost to complete damping down here close to the viscosity of water at 20 degrees Celsius. So this means that you can actually measure the tumbling rate using Parks spectroscopy, and this is what is given on this axis over here, is the estimated tumbling rate using the simplest model you could imagine, the so-called Stokes-Einstein-Debye model, where the tumbling rate is equal to Boltzmann constant times the temperature divided by the volume times the viscosity. And you can see that the PAC data fall on a trend line, which is similar to what you get from fluorescence and in a mass spectroscopy, so it seems to be working. And it also, at least to me, it's somehow intriguing that the solvent viscosity affects the nuclear decay to such an extent that you can actually measure the viscosity wherever you would like to do that. Now, again, shifting to a different project, this is not my work. I wish it was, but it's not. But it's a beautiful application of Parks spectroscopy, I think, where they encapsulated indium in a liposome and injected these liposomes into mice. And as long as the indium is inside the liposome, bound to a small molecule, it tumbles very quickly. So here you are in the so-called fast reorientation time regime in Parks spectroscopy. It tumbles much faster than the frequencies you measure, gives a particular signal and an exponential decay. But as soon as the liposomes are degraded, the indium binds to something else, typically a big biomolecule or protein, and then the tumbling rate becomes much slower. And therefore you can, in vivo, detect the lifetime of such vehicles for drug delivery, such as liposomes. And here was a series of different phospholipids with cholesterol and derivatives of the cholesterol with sugars and amino sugars. And you can see there's quite a large change in the lifetime of the liposomes depending on their composition. This example is sort of similar. You can explore protein-protein interactions. And in this case, it was plastocyanin, which is a small blue copper protein involved in photosynthesis, where it transports electrons, delivers an electron here to photosystem 1. And it means that it should be in the reduced state. It binds a copper ion, so it should be copper 1 when it binds to the photosystem, where it delivers an electron. We use silver as a substitute for copper, so silver 1. And in solution, the silver plastocyanin gives this kind of signal. If you add the photosystem, suddenly the signal lights up. And this is because there is binding and the tumbling rate becomes much longer. So the tumbling doesn't wipe out your signal anymore. And as a reference, we did the same with the cadmium plastocyanin, and there was no response there, as you might expect, because it's 2+. This is a 1+ metal ion side. So this was an example of protein-protein interactions. And going back to local structure at the metal side, we also looked at carboxypeptidase A, where Parks spectra were recorded for 3 different substrates under steady-state peptide hydrolysis conditions. And you can see these 2 peptides, which are so-called good substrates, they are converted quickly, give peaks at the same position and relatively narrow peaks, reflecting that the structure at the metal binding site is very well defined and probably optimized for catalysis. I should say this is a zinc-dependent enzyme, and the zinc was replaced by cadmium, and the cadmium enzyme is still active. And this is a poor substrate where, first of all, you can see that the peaks appear in different positions than those down here. So it's a different metal binding site structure at just before the structure is just before the rate limiting step of the reaction. So this, and also the line width here is larger. So this probably reflects that it's a substrate that doesn't fit in perfectly well. And this enzyme is not optimized for conversion of this particular substrate. So I thought maybe in case you would be interested in PAC spectroscopy, it would be useful to know what has been done and what has not been done. And here is a periodic table where the full lines here indicate that these are tried and tested PAC isotopes. The dotted lines means that they are more difficult. And I should say there are also others, but some where the nuclear properties are not yet well characterized. So there's a little step before actually doing something in biochemistry. You probably need to determine the nuclear properties, the quadrupole moment and the magnetic moment of the nucleus. And then I'm actually close to wrapping up now. The advantages and limitation of PAC spectroscopy is, well, I hope I convinced you that you can get a fingerprint of the local structure. You can actually calculate the properties, the so-called electric field gradient. So if you have an idea about the structure, you can see if that fits with your measured spectrum. You can also measure magnetic fields. I didn't show anything about that, but that can be done and has been done in solid state physics. You can get information about the dynamics on the nanosecond timescale. You can also measure global rotational diffusions of molecules. You need very little material because it's a radio tracer technique, you could say. And you can measure on any physical state. Just a couple of years ago, we managed in a project led by Heinz Haas at ISOLDE to measure on the gas phase. And in vivo experiments are possible because the gamma rays will escape biological material, and you can measure on the outside of whatever you want to look at. The limitations are available PAC isotopes, which was indicated in the previous slide. Production of PAC isotopes, you need to have a production facility for these, getting these radionuclides. And then if you're looking at the actual structure, if you have more than 2 species present, maybe 3, the data analysis becomes very difficult. And then there are the people and the funding, and I hope I remembered everybody. So that's it, and thank you for your attention.